It's March 23rd, 1968, in the dense tropical forest 15 kilometers west of Hue, South Vietnam. Captain James Whitmore crouches behind a fallen mahogany tree, his fatigue soaked through with sweat and something else. He can hear them. The Vietcong are close, maybe 30 meters, maybe less. But it's not the enemy soldiers that make Whitmore's hands shake as he grips his M16. It's what he found 20 minutes ago in the clearing, what they left for him to find. The bodies were arranged deliberately, ceremonially, 5 South Vietnamese civilians, a family, Whitmore thinks, though it's hard to tell now. The father's mouth has been sewn shut with wire. The mother's eyes are gone. The children. Whitmore closes his eyes, but the image is branded there. A twig snaps to his left. Whitmore's finger tightens on the trigger. Through the dense foliage, he sees movement, black pajamas, the distinctive silhouette of an AK-47. But the VC soldier isn't looking for Americans. He's carrying something, a burlap sack that writhes and whimpers. There's someone alive inside. What Captain Whitmore witnessed that day would haunt him for the next 50 years. What he didn't know was that this scene, this technique, was being replicated in hundreds of villages across South Vietnam. A systematic campaign of terror, so brutal, so methodical, that even hardened war correspondents struggled to report it. This is the story of the darkest side of the Vietcong. The tactics they used, the atrocities they committed, the ideology that justified it all. And I'm warning you now, what you're about to hear is hard to stomach. To understand how the Vietcong became capable of such brutality, we need to go back to 1960. December 20th, 1960. A villa in the Tây Ninh Province, just north of Saigon. 63 men sit in a sweltering room, windows covered, guards posted at every entrance. These men represent the leadership of communist cells scattered across South Vietnam. They've gathered in secret because the penalty for their meeting is death by firing squad. They call themselves the National Liberation Front. The Americans will call them the Vietcong, a derogatory contraction meaning Vietnamese communists. But names don't matter. What matters is their mission, the overthrow of the South Vietnamese government by any means necessary. Le Duan, the first secretary of the Workers' Party of North Vietnam, has given them explicit instructions. Terror must be a tool. Fear must be the weapon. The people must know that collaboration with the Saigon regime means death. Among those 63 men is a 28-year-old named Nguyen Van Troy. He's quiet, meticulous, and deeply committed to the cause. He's also the man who will design the Vietcong's terror training program, a curriculum in atrocity. But in December 1960, none of that has happened yet. The Vietcong is still an idea, a network of scattered guerrillas with old French rifles and homemade explosives. They have ideology and determination, but they lack the systematic approach to psychological warfare that will define them. That's about to change. 3 months later, in March 1961, the first terror training camps open in the jungles of War Zone D, 40 kilometers north of Saigon. The curriculum is specific, methodical, scientific. Target selection and prioritization is the first module. Students, mostly young men and women, recruited from rural villages, learn to identify the most valuable terror targets. Not soldiers, not government officials at the top of the hierarchy. Those deaths would be expected, even respected. No, the Vietcong target the infrastructure of village life, teachers, medical workers, agricultural advisors, local administrators who help distribute rice. anyone who makes the South Vietnamese government appear functional, helpful, or legitimate. The reasoning is coldly logical. Kill a soldier, and you've eliminated one enemy. Kill a teacher, and you've eliminated education for an entire village. Kill a doctor, and you've eliminated healthcare. Kill enough of these soft targets, and the government becomes unable to provide basic services. The people lose faith. They begin to see the government as powerless to protect them. And that's when the Vietcong offers an alternative. But here's where the doctrine becomes truly dark. It's not enough to simply kill these targets. The manner of killing must send a message, must create maximum psychological impact, must make an example so terrifying that even thinking about collaborating with the government becomes unbearable. Instructor manuals from these camps, later captured by American forces, read like something from a horror movie. But these aren't fictional scenarios. They're operational procedures. Disembowelment should be performed while the subject is still conscious. This demonstrates the completeness of our power and the totality of their betrayal. Family members, particularly children, should be forced to witness executions. They become messengers who spread fear more effectively than any propaganda. Public displays of corpses should incorporate symbolic elements. Mouths sewn shut for informants. Eyes removed for those who saw too much. Hands severed for those who wrote reports or signed documents. 22-year-old Pham Thi Mai is one of the first graduates of this program. She's from a village near Mai Tho, daughter of a rice farmer, and she joined the Vietcong after American bombs destroyed her family's land. She's motivated by genuine rage at foreign intervention in her country. But after 12 weeks of training, she's been transformed into something else entirely. On April 15th, 1961, Mai receives her first assignment. Eliminate Tran Van Hung, a school teacher in her home district who has been teaching children using Saigon government textbooks. Hung is 26 years old. He teaches 43 students in a one-room schoolhouse. He's not political. He's just trying to give village children an education. Mai knows him. They grew up in the same village. His younger brother was her classmate. That's precisely why she's been chosen for this mission. The night of April 18th, 1961. The village of Mai Phuoc Thai in Dinh Tuong Province. Tran Van Hung is eating dinner with his wife and 3 children when Mai and 4 other VC operatives enter his home. They don't knock. The door splinters off its hinges. Hung recognizes Mai immediately. Pham Mai? What? She doesn't let him finish. You are an instrument of the puppet regime. You poison young minds with imperialist propaganda. The People's Revolutionary Court has found you guilty of crimes against the revolution. Hung's wife begins to scream. The children, ages 4, 6, and 8, cling to their mother. What happens next takes 45 minutes. I'm not going to describe it in detail. What I will tell you is that the Vietcong operatives follow their training manual precisely. They make the family watch. They make the execution symbolic. And when they're finished, they leave Hung's body displayed in front of the schoolhouse with a sign around his neck. This is the fate of collaborators. The village wakes to find their teacher mutilated beyond recognition. The message is received. The school closes. No one volunteers to replace Hung. His family flees to Saigon, leaving everything behind. This scenario, with minor variations, is replicated in 327 villages across South Vietnam between April and December 1961. We know the number. because the Saigon government meticulously documented each case. But historians believe the actual number is much higher. Many incidents in remote villages were never reported. The target selection is precise. In Long An Province, 23 village chiefs are assassinated in a 6-month period. In Kien Hoa Province, every government-appointed medical worker is killed within a year. In Ben Tre Province, the Vietcong eliminates 41 teachers, 17 agricultural advisors, and 32 administrative officials. The South Vietnamese government is hemorrhaging the people who make government function at the local level. But it's not just the killings. It's the psychological warfare component. Dr. Robert Scigliano, a political scientist advising the US mission in Saigon in 1962, writes in his classified reports, "The Viet Cong have weaponized brutality. Each atrocity is designed not just to eliminate an individual, but to create a radius of terror that encompasses entire communities. They're not fighting a guerrilla war. They're fighting a psychological war. And they're winning. The tactics evolve rapidly. By late 1962, the Viet Cong have refined their approach. They develop what they call struggle meetings, public trials where accused collaborators are brought before the village and denounced. These meetings follow a ritual. First, the accused is presented. Their crimes are read aloud, often fabricated or wildly exaggerated. Second, villagers are forced to participate in the denunciation. Anyone who refuses becomes a suspect themselves. This forces the community to become complicit in the victim's fate. Third, the execution is carried out publicly, often with villagers forced to participate directly. Sometimes this means beating the victim to death with farm implements. Sometimes it means more creative methods designed to maximize suffering. The psychological impact is devastating. Villagers aren't just witnesses to atrocity, they're participants. This creates a collective trauma and guilt that binds the community to silence. Who can they report these crimes to when they themselves have blood on their hands? American advisor Captain John Paul Vann encounters one of these struggle meetings in December 1962 near Tan Phu. He arrives with an ARVN army of the Republic of Vietnam patrol, too late to stop it. What he finds in the village square will change his understanding of the war entirely. 47 villagers are sitting in a circle, many crying, all covered in blood. In the center of the circle are the remains of a man, a government agricultural advisor who had been teaching farmers improved rice cultivation techniques. Van interviews the villagers through an interpreter. They're terrified to speak. Finally, an elderly woman breaks down and explains what happened. The VC operatives had arrived at dawn. They'd gathered the entire village. They'd accused the agricultural advisor of being a CIA spy. Absurd, but in the heightened atmosphere of fear, absurdity doesn't matter. Then they'd handed out farming tools, hoes, shovels, bamboo stakes, and forced the villagers to beat the man to death. Anyone who refused was told they would take his place. The beating lasted over an hour. The man had begged for his life, begged for mercy, called out for his mother. The villagers had cried as they struck him, but they'd struck him nonetheless, because the alternative was to join him. When it was over, the Viet Cong operatives had simply disappeared back into the jungle, leaving the villagers to deal with the body and the trauma, and the impossible weight of what they'd been forced to do. Captain Van files a detailed report about what he witnessed. The report makes its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching MACV, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, headquarters in Saigon. It's read, discussed, and then largely ignored. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The US military in 1962 doesn't have a playbook for countering this kind of warfare. They're trained to fight conventional armies. They understand tactics and strategy. But systematic psychological terror designed to make governance impossible? They don't even have vocabulary for it. By 1963, the Vietcong's terror campaign has become industrialized. They established dedicated security sections in each province, units whose sole purpose is identifying and eliminating government supporters. These sections maintain detailed files on every person in their area of operation, who works for the government, who has family members in the ARVN, who attends government-sponsored events, who accepts government assistance. The record-keeping is meticulous. When American forces later capture VC-based camps, they find filing cabinets filled with handwritten dossiers on thousands of civilians. Names, addresses, family relationships, daily routines, vulnerabilities. The level of surveillance rivals anything the East German Stasi would later achieve. In March 1963, a VC security section in Quang Ngai Province compiles a list of 147 priority targets. By August, 131 of those people are dead, but the tactics continue to evolve in disturbing ways. The Viet Cong begin using atrocity as theatre. Executions are staged to maximize visibility and impact. Victims are killed on market days when crowds are largest. Bodies are displayed at crossroads where maximum people will see them. In some cases, VC operatives force family members to carry severed heads through villages as a warning to others. The innovation is grotesque, but it's effective. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Bay, a South Vietnamese province chief, describes the situation in his province in July 1963. We cannot protect the people. The Viet Cong are everywhere and nowhere. They strike at will, brutalize civilians with impunity, and vanish. Government officials are resigning en masse. No one wants to be the next example. In 6 months, we've gone from functional governance to complete anarchy. The numbers tell the story. Between 1961 and 1963, the Viet Cong assassinate approximately 7,200 South Vietnamese civilians. That's an average of 7 people every single day for 3 years. But these aren't random killings. Each one is targeted, deliberate, and designed to maximize terror. Teachers, doctors, village chiefs, religious leaders. Anyone who represents order, stability, or hope. As brutal as these tactics are, they're merely preparation for what's coming. The Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese army allies are refining their techniques, testing their methods, perfecting their approach to mass terror. Everything they're learning will culminate in late January 1968 during the Tet Offensive, specifically in the ancient imperial city of Hue. But to understand what happens in Hue, we need to understand the strategic thinking behind it. In December 1967, North Vietnamese General Von Nguyen Giap finalizes plans for a massive, coordinated offensive timed to coincide with the Tet holiday. The Vietnamese New Year? The Tet Offensive will involve simultaneous attacks on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. But Hue is different. Hue is special. Hue is Vietnam's cultural and intellectual capital, home to the ancient imperial citadel, seat of the Nguyen dynasty, a city of temples, universities, and scholars. Taking Hue wouldn't just be a military victory, it would be a symbolic conquest of Vietnam's soul. The plan for Hue includes a specific component that doesn't exist in plans for other cities. It's called Kế hoạch giao tranh chính trị, the political struggle plan. This component involves pre-prepared lists of people to be arrested and re-educated once VC forces secure the city. The lists are extensive, frighteningly extensive. Government officials, obviously, ARVN officers and their families certainly, but also Catholic priests, Buddhist monks deemed insufficiently revolutionary, teachers at Hue University, doctors who've treated ARVN soldiers, business owners, intellectuals, students who've criticized the North Vietnamese government, anyone with ties to the US presence. The lists contain approximately 2,800 names. By the time the Tet Offensive begins, VC security sections have refined these lists, adding addresses, daily routines, and specific details about each target. They've spent months preparing for this moment. They're not preparing for arrests, they're preparing for extermination. January 31st, 1968, 2:30 a.m. Most of Hue is asleep when the first rockets hit. The Tet ceasefire, a traditional holiday truce, is supposed to be in effect. No one expects an attack. That's precisely why it comes. 10,000 North Vietnamese Army and Vietcong troops pour into Hue from multiple directions. They've been infiltrating for weeks, hiding weapons caches, positioning forces. The attack is coordinated with stunning precision. By dawn, VC forces control most of the city. The flag of the National Liberation Front flies over the Imperial Citadel. RVN forces and American advisors are pinned down in a few defensive positions, desperately calling for reinforcements. But the military battle is only one component of what's happening in Hue. As VC troops secure neighborhoods, specialized security units move through the streets with their prepared lists. They're going door to door. Father Urbain de Pina, a French Catholic priest who runs a local church and school, is one of the first taken. At 4:17 a.m., 6 VC soldiers break down the door of his rectory. They call his name. They know exactly who they're looking for. Father de Pina is 63 years old. He's lived in Hue for 37 years. He's baptized thousands of children, married hundreds of couples, buried entire generations. The soldiers bind his hands with wire and force him into the street. He's still in his sleeping clothes. He asks where they're taking him. They don't answer. Father de Pina is never seen alive again. 3 blocks away, Dr. Horst Gunther Kranick, a German pediatrician working for a medical charity, is pulled from his home along with his wife. Dr. Kranick speaks fluent Vietnamese. He's treated thousands of children for free. He's beloved in Hue. None of that matters. He's a Westerner. That makes him an enemy. His wife screams as they're dragged away. Neighbors who peer through windows quickly close their curtains. No one intervenes. No one can. The pattern repeats across the city. Government officials, military families, intellectuals, religious figures, business owners, anyone on the lists. By the end of January 31st, approximately 800 people have been arrested. But arrested is the wrong word. Abducted, disappeared. They're taken to holding areas, pagodas, schools, warehouses. They're bound, often beaten. Some are interrogated. Most are simply held while VC security officers consult their lists and decide fates. February 2nd, 1968, the Gia Hoi High School, northeastern Hue. Approximately 300 people are being held in the school's courtyard. They've been there for 2 days with no food and minimal water. Many are injured from beatings. All are terrified. At 4 p.m., VC security officers begin calling names. Groups of 20 are separated and marched out of the courtyard. The remaining prisoners hear truck engines starting. Then, silence. The trucks drive the prisoners 5 kilometers to an area called Vietcong, a series of low hills covered in scrub brush. The prisoners are unloaded and forced to dig. They understand what they're digging. Pham Van Thuyen, a 41-year-old government clerk, is in the first group. He'll later tell investigators what happened next. They made us dig for about an hour. The pit was perhaps 2 meters deep, 5 meters long. When we finished, they lined us up at the edge. I was fourth in line. They began shooting, execution style, moving down the line. The first man fell. The second, the third. When they reached me, the pistol misfired. The officer cursed, tried to clear the weapon. In that moment, I threw myself backward into the pit, landing on top of the bodies. More bodies fell on top of me. I felt their blood, their weight. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After perhaps 20 minutes, I heard them begin to shovel dirt into the pit, covering us. I was buried alive beneath bodies and dirt. Thuyen will remain in that mass grave for 7 hours, barely breathing through a small air pocket, before finally digging himself out after dark. He's one of the only survivors of the Hue massacre to witness the executions firsthand. His testimony provides crucial details about the methodology. The VC security units aren't simply executing people, they're categorizing them. Government officials and ARVN officers receive quick executions, usually a bullet. But others, particularly intellectuals, religious figures, and anyone deemed a cultural traitor, receive more elaborate treatment. Some are buried alive. Some are beaten to death. Some are bound with barbed wire and drowned in the perfume river that runs through Hue. The methods vary, but the intent is consistent. Complete elimination of anyone who might oppose communist rule. They made us dig for about an hour. The pit was perhaps 2 meters deep, 5 meters long. When we finished, they lined us up at the edge. I was fourth in line. They began shooting, execution style, moving down the line. The first man fell. The second, the third. When they reached me, the pistol misfired. The officer cursed, tried to clear the weapon. In that moment, I threw myself backward into the pit, landing on top of the bodies. More bodies fell on top of me. I felt their blood, their weight. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After perhaps 20 minutes, I heard them begin to shovel dirt into the pit, covering us. I was buried alive beneath bodies and dirt. Thuyen will remain in that mass grave for 7 hours, barely breathing through a small air pocket, before finally digging himself out after dark. He's one of the only survivors of the Hue massacre to witness the executions firsthand. His testimony provides crucial details about the methodology. The VC security units aren't simply executing people, they're categorizing them. Government officials and ARVN officers receive quick executions, usually a bullet. But others, particularly intellectuals, religious figures, and anyone deemed a cultural traitor, receive more elaborate treatment. Some are buried alive. Some are beaten to death. Some are bound with barbed wire and drowned in the perfume river that runs through Hue. The methods vary, but the intent is consistent. Complete elimination of anyone who might oppose communist rule. February 5th, 1968. Phu Cam Cathedral, Southern Hue, The cathedral has been serving as a refugee centre. Approximately 400 people are sheltering there, mostly Catholic families from surrounding neighbourhoods. They've chosen the cathedral because it's a sacred space. Surely, they reason, even in war, a church will be respected. They're wrong. At dawn, VC troops surround the cathedral. Father Cauventure, the senior priest, meets them at the entrance. He's 68 years old, beloved in the community. He speaks calmly, asking the soldiers to respect the sanctuary and the refugees. An officer responds, "The puppet church is an instrument of American imperialism. There is no sanctuary for collaborators." Father Thieu tries to negotiate. The officer shoots him in the face. The refugees inside the cathedral hear the gunshot. Panic erupts. People try to flee through side doors, but VC troops are everywhere. Over the next 3 hours, 380 people are rounded up, bound, and marched out of the city. They're taken to a salt flat near Duong No, about 8 kilometers northeast of Hue. What happens there is documented by American reconnaissance planes that happen to photograph the area the next day. The aerial photographs show lines of people kneeling at the edge of rectangular pits. They show VC soldiers with weapons. They show the moment of execution. When the pits are finally excavated months later, forensic investigators find the remains of 377 people, many with their hands still bound with wire. The victims range in age from 3 months to 84 years. Entire families are buried together. Mothers clutching infants, children holding parents' hands. The investigators also note something particularly disturbing. Many of the victims, particularly children, show signs of having been buried alive. Soil in their throats and lungs. Defensive wounds on their hands from trying to claw their way out. The battle for Hue lasts 26 days. It's the longest and bloodiest single battle of the Tet Offensive. US Marines and ARVN forces fight building by building, room by room, to retake the city. When the North Vietnamese and VC forces finally withdraw on February 25th, they leave behind a devastated city. Over 80% of buildings have been damaged or destroyed. Approximately 5,000 civilians are dead from the fighting. But it's what American and ARVN troops find in the days after the battle that reveals the true horror. March 2nd, 1968. Corporal Michael Bernhardt, US Army, is on patrol in the Gia Hoi district when his unit detects an odor. Every soldier in Vietnam knows that smell. Death. They follow it to an area of disturbed earth, shallow depressions in the ground, patches of soil that look recently moved. Bernhardt's commanding officer orders them to investigate. They begin to dig. 3 feet down, they hit bodies. The bodies are stacked in layers. Men, women, children. All with hands bound. Many with wire instead of rope. Wire that has cut deeply into wrists, suggesting the victim struggled. Some show signs of execution. Others show signs of having been buried alive. The excavation takes 4 days. They recover the remains of 170 people from that single site. But it's just the first site. Over the next 3 months, as Hue slowly recovers from the battle, more mass graves are discovered. In gardens, under pagodas, in the sandy soil near the river, in the hills outside the city. Each discovery reveals more victims, more wire-bound wrists, more evidence of systematic execution. By June 1968, 19 mass graves have been found containing approximately 1,200 bodies. But the discoveries don't stop. April 26, 1969. More than a year after the battle, a farmer in the Phu Thu district, southeast of Hue, is digging a drainage ditch in his salt flat when his shovel strikes something solid. He assumes it's a rock. He digs around it. It's a skull. He immediately contacts ARVN authorities. Within hours, a full excavation team arrives. What they find is the largest single mass grave from the Hue massacre. The grave site covers approximately 600 square meters. The bodies are layered in multiple strata, suggesting multiple executions over several days. As the excavation progresses, the scale becomes apparent. They recover 428 bodies from the salt flats. Many are still fully dressed, which helps with identification. Forensic examiners find wallets, identification cards, family photographs. They begin the grim process of matching remains to the lists of missing people that families have filed. Among the remains, they find Father Urbain de Pina, the French priest taken on the first day of the occupation. His body shows signs of torture, multiple broken bones, evidence of sustained beating. But cause of death is clear: execution with a bullet to the back of the head. They find Dr. Kranik, the German pediatrician, and his wife, both executed the same way. They find 17 professors from Hue University in a single cluster, suggesting they were executed together. All show similar patterns of injury, extensive trauma consistent with torture before execution. They find entire families, parents, children, grandparents, all bound together and executed. In some cases, young children are still clutching their parents' clothing. The forensic work takes months. It's traumatizing for everyone involved. Vietnamese doctors and nurses work alongside American military personnel to process remains, document evidence, attempt identifications. Captain Ronald Christmas, a U.S. Marine Corps officer who assists with several excavations, will later say, "I saw a lot of horrible things in Vietnam. Combat deaths, casualties from bombing, but this was different. This was industrial, systematic. These weren't casualties of war. These were innocent people hunted down and murdered for the crime of being on a list." By late 1969, the search for mass graves around Hue has slowed. 37 sites have been discovered and excavated. The final count? 2,810 bodies recovered. But investigators believe this is incomplete. Many sites are likely undiscovered. The jungle and rivers have claimed unknown numbers of victims. Many families simply buried relatives they found without reporting to authorities. Conservative estimates place the actual death toll between 4,000 and 5,000 civilians systematically executed during the 26-day VC occupation of Hue. This makes it the single largest massacre of civilians by communist forces during the Vietnam War. It's also one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities of the 20th century, thanks to meticulous forensic investigation and survivor testimony. Yet for decades, the Hue massacre received relatively little attention in Western media or historiography. It was overshadowed by other events of 1968, the My Lai massacre, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the riots at the Democratic National Convention. Even today, many accounts of the Tet Offensive mention Hue's military battle, but gloss over or omit entirely the systematic massacre of civilians. Why? Part of the answer lies in the complex politics of Vietnam War memory. By the late 1960s, American public opinion had turned decisively against the war. The anti-war movement gained strength throughout 1968 and 1970 1969. Atrocities committed by communist forces didn't fit neatly into the emerging narrative of American imperialism and Vietnamese resistance. This created a peculiar situation where well-documented evidence of systematic communist atrocities was downplayed or dismissed by many American intellectuals and journalists who had become convinced that the war itself was unjust. Historian Douglas Pike, who spent years researching the Hue massacre, noted in a 1970 paper, "I've presented this evidence at academic conferences and been met with skepticism bordering on denial. Some colleagues have suggested the mass graves were fabricated or that the victims were actually killed by American bombing. The evidence is overwhelming, but the will to acknowledge it is weak." The North Vietnamese government naturally denied the massacre entirely. Their official position was that any civilian deaths in Hue resulted from American artillery and bombing during the battle to retake the city. This, despite forensic evidence clearly showing execution-style killings, bound wrists, and burial patterns inconsistent with combat deaths. Some American anti-war activists accepted this explanation, or at least refused to acknowledge the evidence of systematic massacre. To do so would complicate the moral clarity of their opposition to the war. But here's what the historical record shows. Beyond any reasonable doubt, the Vietcong and North Vietnamese army entered Hue with prepared lists of people to eliminate. They spent 26 days systematically hunting down, arresting, and executing these people. They targeted intellectuals, religious leaders, government workers, and anyone associated with South Vietnam or the West. They used torture. They buried people alive. They killed entire families. This wasn't collateral damage. This wasn't the fog of war. This was deliberate, planned, systematic extermination of civilians deemed enemies of the revolution. To understand how ordinary people, many of them committed idealists fighting what they believed was a war of national liberation, could participate in such atrocities, we need to understand the ideology that justified them. The Vietnamese Communist Party's doctrine of Giao Tran Vu Trang, armed struggle, included explicit provisions for eliminating class enemies. This wasn't a euphemism or an abstraction. Party documents from the 1960s are chillingly specific about who qualifies as a class enemy and what should be done with them. A 1966 party directive captured from a VC-based camp states, "Reactionary elements who have blood debts to the people must be eliminated physically." These include landlords who exploited peasants, officials who served the puppet regime, intellectuals who spread counter-revolutionary ideas, religious figures who opposed the revolution. Elimination must be thorough to prevent future resistance. Note the language. Blood debts to the people. This framing transforms murder into justice. The executioner isn't committing a crime, he's collecting a debt on behalf of the people. This ideological framework was reinforced through intensive political education. VC cadres underwent hours of daily indoctrination emphasizing the righteousness of their cause and the evil of their enemies. Enemies weren't just opponents. They were subhuman, parasites, cancers that had to be cut out for the body politic to survive. Lê Văn Thum, a VC security officer who defected in 1969, explained it this way in his debriefing. "We were taught that mercy toward class enemies was betrayal of the revolution. That hesitation meant we weren't truly committed. The people we executed weren't people. They were obstacles to liberation. I believed this completely. It took me years to understand what we had actually done. This process of dehumanization is familiar from other genocides and mass atrocities. Transform the victim into something less than human, and ordinary people can commit extraordinary cruelty. But there's another factor specific to the Vietnam context. Nationalist fervor mixed with revolutionary ideology created a particularly toxic combination. The Vietnamese communist movement wasn't just fighting for ideology, it was fighting against what it perceived as centuries of foreign domination. First the Chinese for 1,000 years, then the French for nearly a century, now the Americans. This historical narrative of perpetual resistance against foreign invaders became central to communist propaganda. Anyone who worked with foreigners, French, American, or any Western presence, wasn't just a political opponent. They were traitors to the Vietnamese race itself, collaborators in a long history of national humiliation. This nationalist fury helps explain the particular brutality directed at certain victims in Hue. Vietnamese Catholics, for example, were seen as tools of French colonialism because Catholicism had been brought to Vietnam by French missionaries. Never mind that many Vietnamese Catholics had practiced their faith for generations and considered themselves patriotic Vietnamese. In the communist worldview, their religion marked them as culturally colonized. Similarly, intellectuals who had studied abroad or spoke foreign languages were suspect. Education became evidence of contamination by Western ideas. The very thing that might have made them valuable to a developing nation, their knowledge, their expertise, instead marked them for elimination. Dr. Truong Dinh Tri, a Vietnamese professor of mathematics who survived the Hue massacre by hiding in a colleague's home, later wrote, "They weren't just trying to eliminate people. They were trying to eliminate an entire class of educated, cosmopolitan Vietnamese who might offer an alternative to their narrow vision. They were purging Vietnam's intellectual future." He was right. The massacre of Hue's intellectual community had effects that lasted decades. Hue University didn't fully recover for years. An entire generation of scholarship was lost. Young people who might have become teachers, doctors, researchers were instead dead in mass graves. This was, in effect, an attempted cultural lobotomy. But we need to be clear about something. Hue wasn't an aberration. It was the largest and most concentrated example of tactics the Vietcong had been using throughout South Vietnam for years. Between 1966 and 1972, the South Vietnamese government documented 36,725 civilians assassinated by the Vietcong. That's an average of 17 people murdered every single day for 6 years. And these are just the documented cases. The real number is certainly higher. Let me give you some specific examples that didn't make international headlines, but were just as brutal as anything that happened in Hue. August 8th, 1967. The village of Jak Son in Phuoc Long Province, near the Cambodian border. At 2 a.m., approximately 300 VC soldiers attack this remote montagnard village. The Montagnards are indigenous highland people, ethnic minorities who have historically been marginalized by both North and South Vietnam. Many Montagnard villages accepted South Vietnamese and American aid because it was the first time anyone had offered them medical care, education, or economic assistance. This made them targets. The VC soldiers don't just attack Jak Son, they systematically annihilate it. They herd villagers into longhouses and burn them alive, They throw grenades into bunkers where families are hiding. They hunt down anyone who tries to flee into the jungle. Or consider the hamlet of Duc Duc in Quang Nam Province. On March 29, 1969, VC forces attack this small farming community. They separate men from women and children. The men are tied together and marched into the jungle. Their bodies are found 3 days later, all executed with bullets to the back of the head. But it's what happened to the women and children that's particularly horrifying. Survivor testimony, later corroborated by forensic evidence, indicates that the VC soldiers spent hours torturing them before execution. The goal wasn't intelligence gathering. It was terror. Pure terror. 96 civilians died at Duc Duc. The hamlet was abandoned afterward. To this day, it's an uninhabited ghost town. These incidents, Jackson, Duc Duc, and hundreds of others, follow the same pattern. Systematic targeting of civilians, maximum brutality, and the use of atrocity as a tool of psychological warfare. Because that's what we need to understand. This wasn't random violence, or the excesses of undisciplined soldiers. This was strategy. The Vietcong's theory of revolutionary warfare, adapted from Mao Zedong's teachings but refined for the Vietnamese context, held that the people were the sea in which guerrillas swam. Control the people, and you control the war. But control doesn't come through winning hearts and minds. At least not primarily. Control comes through fear. Make the people more afraid of you than of the government. Make collaboration with the government literally fatal. Make the consequences of opposing you so horrific that even thinking about resistance becomes unbearable. This strategy had a certain brutal logic to it. The South Vietnamese government and American forces could offer material benefits, medical care, schools, infrastructure. But they couldn't offer perfect protection. They couldn't be everywhere at once. The Vietcong, by contrast, could be anywhere at any time. They lived among the people. They knew who collaborated and who didn't. And they were willing, even eager, to demonstrate the consequences of collaboration in the most graphic terms possible. A captured VC directive from 1968 explicitly states, "One dramatic execution is worth more than 1,000 propaganda pamphlets. The people must understand that we have the power of life and death, and that we exercise it without mercy against traitors." American counterinsurgency efforts, for all their sophistication and resources, never developed an effective response to this strategy of terror. How do you protect every civilian in a country of 17 million people? How do you counter an enemy who is willing to murder children to make a point? Lieutenant Colonel William Corson, a U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer who served multiple tours in Vietnam, wrote in his 1968 book, The Betrayal, "We're losing the war for the people, not because our ideology is wrong or our tactics are poor, but because we're not willing to match the enemy's level of ruthlessness. And thank God we're not. But that moral restraint comes with a strategic cost we haven't figured out how to overcome. And here's where we need to talk about American complicity, not in the sense of committing atrocities, but in the sense of failing to recognize their significance. Throughout the 1960s, American military and political leadership focused obsessively on body counts, kill ratios, and territorial control. They measured progress through metrics like Hamlet security ratings and pacification percentages. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war they were fighting. The Vietcong weren't primarily trying to hold territory or win conventional battles. They were trying to make governance impossible. They were trying to create a psychological environment where collaboration with the government meant death, and resistance to the VC meant also death, but hopefully less certain death. American intelligence officers documented VC atrocities meticulously. The reports piled up, but they never became central to American strategy or public understanding of the war. Part of this was classification. Many of the most detailed reports on VC terror tactics remained classified for decades. Part was the sheer volume of information competing for attention in a complex, multifaceted war. But part was also a kind of cognitive dissonance. The narrative of Vietnamese communists as guerrilla fighters resisting foreign imperialism had taken root in American and international consciousness. Evidence that contradicted that narrative, evidence of systematic terror, mass murder, ideological purges, was psychologically uncomfortable. It was easier to focus on American failures and atrocities. And there were plenty of those. My Lai happened, free fire zones killed civilians, American bombing caused tremendous suffering. But acknowledging American wrongdoing doesn't require ignoring communist atrocities. Both can be true simultaneously. Yet that's not how the conversation evolved, either during the war or in the decades since. So what happened to the people responsible for these atrocities? This is where the story becomes even more frustrating. When North Vietnam won the war in 1975, the people who had planned and executed the terror campaigns weren't prosecuted. They were celebrated. Many received promotions, medals, and positions of authority in the unified Vietnamese government. Le Van Chi, the VC security officer who oversaw operations in Hue during the massacre, became a mid-level official in the Ministry of Public Security. He died in 2003, never having faced any accountability for his role in the deaths of thousands. The political officers who trained cadres in assassination techniques, many became university professors, teaching the next generation of Vietnamese about the glorious resistance against American imperialism. The systematic terror against civilians was reframed as justified violence against class enemies and traitors. In official Vietnamese Communist Party historiography, the Hue massacre either doesn't exist or is dismissed as American propaganda. This lack of accountability has had lasting effects on Vietnamese society. There's been no truth and reconciliation process, no acknowledgement of what was done, no apology to the victims' families. Instead, there's official silence punctuated by denial. In 2018, when a group of international historians organized a conference to discuss the Hue massacre, the Vietnamese government refused to allow it to be held in Vietnam. They threatened to arrest any Vietnamese citizens who participated. The conference was eventually held in the United States, but Vietnamese scholars who wanted to attend faced threats and intimidation. The mass grave sites around Hue, some have been preserved as historical sites, but the official narrative is that the victims died from American bombing, not VC execution, despite overwhelming forensic evidence to the contrary. This revisionist history is enforced through Vietnam's strict censorship laws. Books that discuss VC atrocities in detail are banned. Researchers who try to investigate these events face harassment and, in some cases, imprisonment. So the truth is known, documented, and undeniable. But it's also officially unacknowledged by the government of Vietnam. But Vietnam isn't alone in trying to erase this history. The international community has largely been complicit in this silence. In 1968, the International Control Commission, a body established by the Geneva Accords to monitor ceasefire violations, received detailed reports about the Hue massacre. They filed them and did nothing. No investigation, no condemnation, no consequences. The United Nations? Silent, despite documentation that met any reasonable definition of crimes against humanity. The UN never investigated or issued resolutions about VC atrocities against civilians. Amnesty International and other human rights organizations focused primarily on South Vietnamese government abuses and American war crimes. VC atrocities received comparatively little attention. Why? Part of it was geopolitics. The Cold War created strange alignments and willful blindness. Communist atrocities were downplayed by those sympathetic to leftist movements. Many intellectuals and activists who opposed the Vietnam War simply couldn't accept evidence that complicated their narrative. Part of it was access. North Vietnam and the Vietcong didn't allow independent investigators into their controlled areas. Evidence of their crimes came primarily from South Vietnamese sources, which were viewed as biased. Never mind that the evidence included forensic reports, survivor testimony, and mass graves that couldn't be fabricated. And part of it was, frankly, propaganda success. The North Vietnamese and Vietcong were excellent at controlling their international image. They presented themselves as scrappy underdogs fighting against imperialist oppression. That narrative was compelling, and in many respects true. They were fighting against foreign intervention, but they were also systematically murdering civilians on a massive scale. Both things are true. The international community chose to focus on one truth and ignore the other. To understand the scale of what we're discussing, let's put these atrocities in comparative context. Between 1960 and 1975, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces systematically executed between 50,000 and 100,000 South Vietnamese civilians. Conservative estimates from multiple sources cluster around 60,000 to 75,000. For comparison, the My Lai massacre, the most infamous American atrocity of the war, killed approximately 500 Vietnamese civilians in a single day. It was a horrific war crime, rightfully condemned, and the perpetrators faced court-martial. But the Viet Cong carried out the equivalent of a My Lai massacre every 9 days for 15 years. The difference? My Lai was an aberration that violated American military law and resulted in prosecutions. VC assassinations were a policy that aligned with communist doctrine and resulted in promotions. Or consider the Rwandan genocide of 1994, where approximately 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. The international community rightly calls this one of the great atrocities of the 20th century. There were international tribunals, prosecutions, extensive documentation. The VC terror campaign killed somewhere between 1/10 and 1/8 as many people over a much longer period, but it's barely mentioned in international discourse about human rights and war crimes. I'm not trying to create an Olympiad of suffering or minimize any atrocity by comparing it to others. Each act of mass violence is uniquely terrible. Each victim's death is an individual tragedy, but the disparity in international attention, condemnation, and historical memory is striking and needs to be acknowledged. Today, Vietnam is a rapidly developing country with a young, dynamic population. The war ended nearly 50 years ago. Most Vietnamese alive today weren't born when these events happened. But the legacy persists. The mass graves around Hue are there, though many are unmarked or misidentified. The villages that were destroyed remain abandoned. The families that lost multiple generations still carry that grief. And the official silence continues. In Vietnam, you cannot publicly discuss VC atrocities without risking arrest. Bloggers who write about the Hue massacre face endangering national security charges. Historians who try to document these events are blacklisted. The government's position is that acknowledging these atrocities would undermine the legitimacy of the Communist Party, which derives its authority from the narrative of righteous resistance against foreign aggression. But this creates a moral and historical problem. How does a society heal from trauma that it cannot acknowledge? How do victims' families find closure when official history denies their loved ones were murdered? These aren't just Vietnamese questions. They're questions every society faces when confronting difficult historical truths. Do we prioritize stability and the current government's legitimacy, or truth and justice for victims? Do we sweep uncomfortable history under the rug for the sake of moving forward, or do we insist on full accounting, even if it's painful and disruptive? There's no easy answer, but the default toward forgetting, toward official denial, toward enforced silence, that has costs too. It's been 57 years since the Hue massacre. The people who planned it, who executed it, who carried it out, most are dead now. The victims are dead. Many of the survivors are dead. But the story remains. In the jungles west of Hue, there are still mass graves that haven't been found. In villages across what was South Vietnam, there are families who lost members to VC assassination and never learned what happened to them. In Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, there are elderly people who lived through the terror campaign but cannot speak about it publicly. Their grandchildren don't know their family history. That knowledge will die with them. The Vietcong's terror campaign succeeded in many of its objectives. It made governance nearly impossible in rural South Vietnam. It created a climate of fear that prevented effective resistance to communist control. It demonstrated that the Saigon government couldn't protect its people. But it failed in one crucial respect. It didn't create a better Vietnam. The unified Vietnam that emerged after 1975 isn't the liberated paradise that communist propaganda promised. It's an authoritarian state that suppresses dissent, controls information, and denies its own history. The teachers and doctors and intellectuals who were murdered in Hue, the ones who might have helped build a better society, their loss is still felt. Vietnam's intellectual and cultural development was set back generations by the systematic elimination of educated, independent-minded people. That's the real legacy of the terror campaign. Not just the deaths, tragic as they were, but the destruction of human potential, the silencing of alternative voices, the creation of a society built on fear rather than hope. Captain James Whitmore, the officer we met at the beginning of this video, returned to Vietnam in 2005 as a civilian. He's 83 years old now. He travelled to the site where he witnessed the VC execution in 1968. The jungle has reclaimed the clearing. There's no marker, no memorial, just trees and silence. Whitmore stood there for a long time, remembering. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He prayed for all of them, for the victims, for the perpetrators, for the entire tragic, brutal, unnecessary war. "I don't know if it helps," he told an interviewer later. "I don't know if anything helps. But somebody needs to remember. Somebody needs to bear witness to what happened. Not to keep hatred alive, but to insist on truth. To say, this happened. These people lived. Their deaths meant something, even if history has tried to forget them. That's why we tell these stories. Not to settle political scores or validate one side over another in a war that ended decades ago, but to remember, to bear witness, to insist that the victims of atrocity, all victims, regardless of who victimized them, deserve to have their stories told. The darkest side of the Vietcong wasn't their tactical brilliance, or their determination, or their successful revolution. It was their willingness to systematically murder innocents and call it justice, to terrorize civilians and call it liberation, to destroy the very people they claimed to be fighting for. That's the truth that history books often skip. That's the uncomfortable reality that doesn't fit neatly into simple narratives about the Vietnam War. But it's the truth, and it matters. Thank you for watching. I know this was a difficult video. If you made it this far, I appreciate your willingness to engage with hard history. As always, links to sources and further reading are in the description below. Take care of yourselves.